Europe is dividing on foreign policy, and it's all because of China. Welcome to China Insider. I'm David Zhang. Before we get started, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, comment below what your thoughts are on today's topic. There's a bifurcation in Europe's foreign policy. What once united most of Europe against common threats like Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia are now diverging. Leaders from Central and Eastern Europe and former Soviet nations took on the mantle against the expansion of Communist China, and contrast that with the French vision of copying the homework of Charles de Gaulle, and with it, we see a dividing Europe on this front. The fundamental problem boils down to Europe wanting to be a great third power. And in this competition between the United States and China, if they cannot find the place at this time, Europe's many countries may choose to divide and go independent themselves in terms of where they want to stand along the two lines. So let's talk about it. Today, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock held a joint press conference with China's Foreign Minister Zhang, and the two held clearly different views that was different than the French president and his vision, and Macron's stance, of course, is to hug China, appeasement. At least Baerbock reiterated that the Taiwan Strait cannot be solved with force, and she questions why China doesn't call out Russia's aggression. You might know that France and Germany are the big influencers in the European Union right now following Britain's exit from the European Union. And it's clear that the latest fashion in foreign policy for Europe is a France-centric appeasement versus an EU-centric de-risking. And it seems, at least verbally, Germany is siding more with the EU-centric view of China. And still, though, both Germany and France are prone to cozying up to China, so we'll have to see if Europe can truly be so-called this third power in the world, or will we see an internal split? The two diverging view of China is this. One, led by Macron and the European Council and its president Charles Michel, and the main point is to stand by and allow China to invade Taiwan by force or by conversion. And the other, which is led by the European Commission and many European nations, of course outside of France and Hungary. Right now, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the EU Commission, led by von der Leyen, form the relatively tougher stance on China. So bear with me. Let's first dive into the EU-centric de-risking approach to China and, by extension, Russia. Today, the Vice President of the European Commission, Joseph Borrell, he repeated the EU's stance, quote, "It will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the European Union to maintain a relationship of trust with China, which I would like to see if China does not contribute to the search for a political solution based on Russia's withdrawal from the Ukrainian territory. Neutrality in the face of a violation of international law is not credible. We do not ask anyone to align with our position. We simply ask to admit and recognize that in this case there was a serious violation of international law." Neutrality is the key. Right now, it's clear that China is siding with Russia. At the same time, it won't seek a plan to stop Russia. It's not beneficial for the Chinese Communist Party to stop Russia. At the same time, Europe's neutrality does not exist either. All of Europe has been sucked into the war in Ukraine, and they must oppose Russia's invasion, which they have been doing so. By this principle, Europe as a whole should also oppose China's invasion of Taiwan. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki on Ukraine and Taiwan says the following, quote, "You cannot protect Ukraine today and tomorrow by saying Taiwan is not your business. You need to support Ukraine if you want Taiwan to stay as it is." He also says this.
I think that, God forbid, if Ukraine falls, if Ukraine gets conquered, the next day China can attack Taiwan. I see lots of connectivity, lots of interdependencies between the situation in Ukraine and the situation in China.
Just like Japan, the Polish recognize the threat of communism and authoritarianism as they were on the front line, and are still on the front line, bordering these aggressors, which makes you wonder why both France and Germany, the birthplace of the Paris Commune, the violent revolutions, and Karl Marx, wouldn't be tougher on communism today. Anyways, when the EU chief von der Leyen said to de-risk with China, she basically says to strategically move critical aspects away from China, to avoid risks that would damage Europe's financial interests. And this de-risk approach is basically what the United States calls reshoring the supply chain. EU as a whole, outside of France and Hungary, seems to support the idea of involving itself in the process of what is happening in Taiwan because of Ukraine. The majority of Europe, especially Poland, Czechia, or Lithuania, and the former Soviet states know that Taiwan is important to Europe. Their actions have shown so, for example, by visiting Taiwan with their delegations. In fact, many are now calling this the new European foreign policy. So I see this as more of a realist approach to what is actually happening now, what must be done to stop the threat now. Now, let's take a pause and answer why Europe should actually care about Taiwan. To keep things short and concise, one, no one wants to see Russia and China dominate the world. That's not beneficial to most of the free countries. And that, especially to the former communist states like Poland, draws the hunting memories of the last century. And second, Europe sees the value of Taiwan in technology, in preserving democracy, and defending common values, values like human rights, freedom, and so much more. And third, again, this has to do with history and with gratitude. The US spent the 20th century as the keeper against aggression. They helped to liberate Europe from two major threats: Germans in both world wars and communist Russia. And it's about giving back the efforts of the United States, for thanking them. And that's why we see many are willing to side with the United States. For one, they recognize that the United States stands with the free world, who at this moment is basically the beacon of freedom and beacon of light for many around the world. Us living in the US might not realize, but people around the world actually view the United States in a very positive manner. So because of this, we have to see that Europe is about twofold. So let's talk about the second half, the so-called old Europe. The French president's view is largely reflected in its contemporary history. Old Europe wants to revive its nationalism, which is, again, a powerful France in the case of Macron. Influential in its own independent ways, but outside of that, not so much. This is Macron's way of copying the work of Charles de Gaulle, the French president who was a big factor in France's contemporary development, especially being a war hero from World War II, doing his own thing in the Cold War up until his death. Many in France consider him, de Gaulle of course, the greatest since Napoleon, and as an elected president. Now, as Americans or even outside of France, we judge them quite differently, of course. Now, this is all fine, right? We can have cultural, historical differences, we can have whatever interpretation of nationalism, whatever. But there's a simple fundamental argument here, and it's about morality. The issue here is that the Americans helped to liberate France from Nazi occupation. Even if this is just owning a little favor to the Americans, like if you have a neighbor who once helped you out when somebody went into your house to rob you, he came by and he helped you out. He drove the robbers away. And now that neighbor, in this case the United States, is in some trouble. The least you can do is to offer some help, no? Plus, the US isn't even asking France to do much other than just, don't be a stumbling block. Just basically you can remain silent and not do anything. It will be more helpful than what France did. But the French basically said no. Basically, Macron is using the strategic autonomy as an excuse or disguise for their ungratefulness. For example, Charles de Gaulle attempted to challenge American dominance and its dollar system. It seeks to play a different approach during the Cold War. In the 60s, signing an agreement with the Soviet Union. De Gaulle opposed NATO. He withdrew the French troops in the 60s. His idea to make France an independent actor on the world stage is, of course, to us, a big problem. But to the French public, maybe it was the rise of French nationalism, and it's the fact that he basically wanted to make France great again. However, de Gaulle, as critical as we can for his decisions, he did so after the Second World War. De Gaulle would never make such statements or actions as Macron on Taiwan, telling China that Europe should step aside and watch Taiwan get taken during the war. And that's basically what's happening now. So when de Gaulle escaped to England, he was 100% in agreement to stop the Nazis. Never would he be challenging the US's effort to stop Nazi Germany back then in the middle of World War II. Macron, however, seems to only be copying half of de Gaulle's work, and Macron's seat to presidency, of course, is that he copies the way de Gaulle has been, wanting to make France great again. I make this joke, everybody wants to be Trump, right? To make their own country great again. Some just don't dare to openly say it. But again, it seems Macron doesn't understand the reason why de Gaulle did what he did is because of the time and the time in which things were done. And here's my problem with Macron. And basically, it's all history repeating itself, but a failing way. So here it goes. During the Cold War, what de Gaulle did to the Soviet Union actually cannot be copied today by the Communist Party of China, in that what Macron is trying to do to China is not the same as de Gaulle, simply because the Cold War has largely been a hot one in Europe today. Right? This new Cold War, China has already been using the vassal, which is Russia, to invade Ukraine, and to Europeans, there's no third option between choosing the US or China. One stands for authoritarianism, the other one for freedom. And like I said, Macron's concession to China is weakening the liberal order, including the ideas of democracy, the market economy, and international cooperation. Instead of strengthening this order, which, by the way, France took part of building together with the US in the past, France is now trying to be cool for the idealistic fantasy of its past. And that's the problem of reality versus idealism. And too much idealism, I think, leads to China taking advantage. And this is why the so-called New Europe is desperate to step up its defense. Meanwhile, Old Europe is dragging everyone down. New Europe is more realistic about what is happening. And Macron's strategic autonomy, in a sense, is basically trying to be de Gaulle and his legacy, but not being completely studying what his ancestors had basically done. And again, de Gaulle's legacy of not being subservient to America makes sense in a way to the French. But since Macron only copied half of de Gaulle's homework, it seems like he forgot the part where this all comes after the common enemy is defeated. Macron calls for independent thinking from the US. From the French point of view, you cannot say that it is wrong. But from a greater scope, it is wrong in the context that today's communist China is not the Soviet Russia of the past. Once again, it boils down to a fundamental idea of gratitude. And let's not kid ourselves in thinking that, oh, being subservient to the US is somehow a disgrace. This is a big way in which the CCP has been able to drive wedges between nations. They label everything led by America as problematic and imperialism. This label is to associate with all the wrongdoings, and anything in the world that is happening today is all because of the United States. It undermines the foundational values of this nation. It undermines the visions of the founding fathers, the idea that all men are created equal, and everything else that the United States has provided to the world. Now, this isn't an argument of history, and I'm not trying to be a CIA-funded spy of some sort, as some people claim. This is an anti-China rhetoric. It's true. But China has been using this to twist history to make the US seem like that it is the eternal trouble. Macron precisely believes that being a little brother to the US is a bad thing. But look at Japan. The Imperial Japan of World War II is different than that today. Back then, they fought against the United States in a brutal Pacific theater. After the war was defeated, Japan was defeated, Japan was not there to cry about it. It was rebuilt by the United States, and then it successfully grew out of the shadow of its former self. Today, Japan is the most important ally and a friend of the US in the Pacific Ocean, and probably the most successful democratic nation in Asia. No one calls Japan a barking dog of the United States, nor a servant of American overlords. It's not that the voice from the outside that makes you the subservient dog to the United States. It's your own humility that determines who you are. And apparently France lacks confidence in its ability so much that they have to physically distance themselves from the US to appear strong. And that strength only appears as appeasement. Today's communist China challenging the world order is on a scale like nothing ever before, and there's no iron curtain by the CCP. It is in fact doing the opposite. It's challenging and expanding influence across all 5 continents. So if Europe can agree on a China strategy based on its security and long-term economic interests, instead of only choosing the short-term stuff and interest of some companies, it will face dire consequences. And China has studied this well. Their divide and conquer on France worked. If France will play a major influential role in Europe, it needs to be given incentives, right? So that's why Macron brought 50 business leaders with him to China, and Macron is encouraging China to become more aggressive in its neighborhood and globally. And it considers Europe to be a geopolitically neutral part of the world in which that it won't support the United States, and it seems like it wants to be closer to China. And now, basically, the Chinese Communist Party only has to deal with the US and Asian democracies, and it leaves Europe open. And it already basically happened, but will probably become way more apparent, is that the US is now forced to take care of the international order without Europe. Together with its Asian allies, where Japan is the key driver, it abandoned Europe. In turn, the next decade will also not focus on Europe. It will be on Asia. And with it, a weakening European relations with the Indo-Pacific. Countries like Japan, India, Australia, South Korea may not even trust the Europeans anymore. The weakening of the confidence in the once glorious Europe is not because of many, but because of one leader's wrongdoing. And that's Macron. Now, I'm not a fan of the US providing so much support to Ukraine, because there's just not enough resource to fight a 2-front war. But without the United States, Europe alone, they won't pick up the burden to provide for the regional conflict themselves. So I am worried that the US will have to spend effort in Ukraine, all the while trying to prepare for a Taiwan scenario, and that distraction is forcing the US to probably want to spend less in Europe, worry less about the Europeans, and focus more on Asia. But it just can't, because somebody in Europe wants to play different. Either way, it's not a good look for Macron. All right, that's it today for our discussion and analysis on the 2 diverging foreign policy in Europe, one leading to believe that they want to be independent, and apparently that's appeasing China. The other one is about focusing on this free world. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and if you do like it, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video to help the video get spread around on YouTube so more people can watch it. And once again, this is China Insider. I'm David Zhang. We'll see you next time.